The spring session of the King's Bench was not known for mercy. The gallery above the great courtroom filled before 9 o'clock that Wednesday morning in April of 1814. Gentlemen pressing free deep along the railing, and ladies who had no business there at all, whispering behind their gloves into their companions' ears. They had not come for the docket's other matters, they had come for this. Miss Cecily Ashmore stood at the plaintiff's bar in a grey wool gown that had been pressed carefully the night before and was beginning to show it. The document she held was cream-colored, folded in quarters, the wax of an old seal flaking at one corner. She held it the way a person holds something they cannot afford to set down, not tightly, not desperately, but with the continuous, steady attention of someone who has been holding it for a long time and has learned what inattention costs. Edmund Vane, the Duke of Ravenscroft, sat at the defense table 20 feet away and did not look at her. He was everything she remembered, and nothing like what she had believed him to be. Dark hair, silver at one temple now, though it had not been silver 8 months ago. A jaw set as though he had arrived at some conclusion before the session opened, and did not intend to revisit it. His barrister leaned close and said something low. The Duke nodded once, and his gaze moved to the bench above, to the Lord Justice settling his robes, to the clerk arranging papers to every corner of the room that was not Cecily. The charge, when it was read, was fraud, the deliberate misrepresentation of a legal document, the false claiming of a title to which she had no right. The crowd above them breathed in a collective suspension, and Cecily felt it against the back of her neck, like the first cold air of a season that has not yet decided what it intends to be. If you have ever watched someone deny knowing you while standing close enough that you could reach out and touch them, then you know something of what the air tasted like in that courtroom. If you have not, perhaps stay a little longer. Because the document in Cecily Ashmore's hands was not a forgery, and the man who would not look at her had signed it himself. 8 months earlier, on a Tuesday evening in the last week of August, a quiet ceremony had taken place in the vestry of the parish church of St. Giles, in the village of Hartmore, Derbyshire, with the church's rector performing the rite and 3 witnesses present. The rector's name was Reverend Thomas Sable. The witnesses were Mrs. Agnes Partridge, housekeeper of Ravenscroft Hall, and Mr. Gideon Holt, a King's Counsel of long acquaintance with the Vane family who had come up from London for the grouse season and had been pressed into service as a witness when the couple could not wait until the family solicitor was available on Friday. The groom was Edmund Algernon Vane, Duke of Ravenscroft. The bride was Miss Cecily Margaret Ashmore, spinster, of Hartmore Village, 24 years of age, daughter of the late Mr. James Ashmore, solicitor. It was not what Cecily had imagined for her wedding, if she had imagined one at all, which she had tried not to do once she understood the position she occupied in the world. Her father had died the previous spring in March, on a grey Thursday morning between breakfast and noon, which Cecily had always thought was the most ordinary possible time to die. He had been a small man with careful habits and large ambitions for his daughters, and his death had caught him in the middle of 4 ongoing cases, and a pile of correspondence that had taken Cecily the better part of 2 months to sort. He had left her precisely what a country solicitor with 2 daughters and 1 modest property could leave a house that was not entailed and a sum that would not last 5 years on careful management. Her elder sister Margaret had married the previous autumn, and was settled in Yorkshire with her clergyman husband in a comfortable living that left no room, practically or financially, for a younger sister who was managing quite well on her own. "Thank you." This was the phrase Margaret had used in her last letter. "You are managing quite well," and Cecily had read it twice to confirm that it meant what it appeared to mean, which was that the managing was Cecily's responsibility and was likely to remain so. She had folded the letter and put it in the correspondence drawer and returned to her father's outstanding case files with the equanimity of someone who had anticipated this outcome. She had been managing things, in one capacity or another, since she was 17. The household accounts, the correspondence with her father's clients when he was ill, the small repairs to the house that required a steady hand and a refusal to believe they would fix themselves. She was not bitter about any of it. She was simply accustomed to the fact that competence is often confused with contentment by those who benefit from it. Edmund Vane had come to Hartmoor in July, as he did most summers, to oversee his estate and to leave London behind for a few weeks. He had met Cecily when a matter of local land boundaries had brought him to her father's old office, where she had been quietly settling the last of her father's outstanding cases because there was no one else to do it, and because her father had always said a contract deserved to be honored regardless of whether the man who made it was still alive. The boundary dispute in question involved 3 families, 2 hedgerows, and a water source that had been shared amicably for 40 years, until the younger generation began insisting on precision. And Cecily had spent the better part of 3 days reading every relevant instrument in her father's files before she felt qualified to explain the situation to anyone. Edmund had stood in the doorway of that small office on the appointed Tuesday morning and watched her explain it to a farmer twice her age, with the patience and precision of someone who understood that precision in matters of law is kindness. He had said nothing particularly notable when the farmer left. He had thanked her for her time and said the matter was now clear to him. She had shown him out and returned to her desk and thought very little of it. He had come back the following week on a pretext so thin she had seen through it immediately and had the grace not to say so. What followed across that summer was nothing so dramatic as a courtship. It was quieter than that and more careful, and conducted with the particular discretion of 2 people who understood that Hartmoor was a small village and that discretion was its own kind of respect. He rode past her on the lane and stopped to ask about the progress of the boundary case. She accepted 3 invitations to dine at Ravenscroft Hall at the neighborhood families gathered in the drawing room, and sat at the far end of the table and answered his questions about Hartmoor's history with the same measured precision she brought to everything. He was not a man who smiled easily. She was not a woman who needed him to. She had noticed across those 3 evenings that he watched her when he thought she was occupied elsewhere, and that when she said something direct, which she did reliably because she had never learned to do otherwise, something in his face settled, as though directness was a form of relief. When he finally said what he meant, on the evening of the 23rd of August, standing in the garden behind her father's house, with the last light dropping behind the hill, and neither of them pretending any more that he had called to inquire after the boundary case, she had known what he was going to say, and had not allowed herself to believe it until the words were in the air between them. He had asked her to keep it quiet, just until the season ended, and he had managed his family. He had reasons for the secrecy, he said. His mother had strong opinions, and there was a particular family with a particular daughter who had been mentioned too many times already, and he wanted to present the marriage as fact rather than ask permission for it. He had looked at her steadily when he said this. He had said he did not want her to be the subject of a campaign. She had believed him. That, in the end, was the thing she could not quite forgive herself for. Not the marriage. Not the secrecy. Not the waiting. The believing. She had believed him because she had not understood, then, what Lady Dorothea Vane was capable of. Chas. The Dowager Duchess had learned of the marriage in the 2nd week of September, when Mrs. Poor and Partridge, who was loyal to the house rather than to its matriarch, had mentioned it in passing to the butler, who had mentioned it in a less careful passing to the housekeeper's assistant, who was Lady Dorothea's creature. By the time Lady Dorothea sat across from her son in the green drawing-room at the Vane townhouse in Grosvenor Square, she had had 4 days to decide exactly what she intended to do about it. Lady Dorothea was 61 years old, small-boned and erect, with white hair dressed high, and the eyes of a woman who had spent 40 years reading rooms and knowing exactly where she stood in each one. She did not raise her voice. She did not make threats. She simply assessed what she needed and then arranged for it with the unhurried competence of long practice. To Miss Arabella Finch, in the anteroom before a musicale that same week, she had said, in a voice that carried no particular weight, "The girl from Hartmoor is an impostor, of course." These provincial creatures form attachments and then claim all manner of things. Miss Finch, who was 22 and had been positioned by her family alongside the Duke of Ravenscroft for 2 seasons, had nodded without quite knowing whether to believe it, and had said nothing, which Lady Dorothea found entirely satisfactory. Edmund himself, the Dowager found, was easier to manage than she had expected. Not because he did not care about Cecily. She had been watching her son long enough to understand that he did. She knew rather what Caroline had done to him, and she knew precisely how that wound operated, and she pressed it where it was most tender. "You trusted your own judgment about a woman once before," she said. "And you were mistaken. You called it love. She called it convenience. I am not saying Miss Ashmore is the same. I am saying that your judgment in these matters has not always served you. There are witnesses who say the ceremony never occurred. Mrs. Partridge's memory is not reliable on dates. The rector, I am told, has no clear recollection. Gideon Holt was in his cups that evening. These things do happen. There was a witness who came to Cecily with none of this. His name was Thomas, a young footman at Ravenscroft Hall, who had once carried a letter for Cecily from the hall to her father's house, and had been thanked for it, so genuinely that he had remembered the quality of the transaction. He had stood outside her cottage door on a grey October morning and told her, his face miserable with the telling, what he had overheard 3 days prior in the corridor outside the Duke's private study. The Duke had been telling his solicitor that he had reason to believe the document was not what the young woman claimed it was, that the matter would need to be investigated, and that no further correspondence should be directed to Hartmore address. The footman had said, his voice very careful, "I thought you should know. Miss, your grace, that is. I thought you should know." She had stood at the door for a moment after he left. Then she had gone inside and opened her father's old document case, the brown leather one with the brass clasp that she had carried from Hartmore to London when she understood she would need to pursue this herself. And she had taken out the contract and unfolded it and read it through, as her father had always said, one ought to do with any document, whose terms seemed about to be disputed. Slowly, aloud. Every word. The seal was there. Edmund's signature was there. Reverend Sable's attestation was there. Her own signature, the ink slightly uneven where she had been cold. The word impostor had been used a second time in November, in the public proceedings of a preliminary hearing at which Cecily had appeared to assert her claim and the opposing barrister, a lean man with spectacles named Mr. Spree. Clarence Duff had stated to the court that his client had every reason to believe the document in question was not genuine, that the young woman presenting it was not who she claimed to be, that the evidence of the ceremony was thin, and that the court was being asked to credit the word of a woman unknown to society against the sworn statements of 3 witnesses who had no memory of any such event. He had used the word impostor twice in 2 sentences, and the gallery had murmured with the complicated pleasure of people who are not sure what they believe, but are very interested in watching someone else prove it. Cecily had said nothing. She had held the document and let Mr. Duff speak, and looked at the bench because looking at Edmund, who was there, 2 rows back, with his eyes on the window, would have cost her more than she could afford to spend. There was a moment, 4 weeks before the spring hearing, that the Duke did not know she had seen. He had come to the offices of her solicitor in Lincoln's Inn, where she had an appointment that she kept in the anteroom while a previous matter ran long. The anteroom was a narrow room on the first floor with 2 wooden chairs and a window that looked onto the inner court of the inn, the stones below gray with February, and a single plane tree standing bare in the center, as though it had forgotten to leave when the rest of the season did. Cecily had been sitting there for 20 minutes, with her document case on her knees, and her hands folded on top of it, going over in her head the order of the points she intended to make, when she heard the voice in the corridor. She had known his voice, the particular low register of it, the way he closed sentences. She had set that knowledge aside, along with a number of other things she could not yet afford to look at directly. She had not known he would be there, and she did not think he had known she would be there either, because when she came around the corner of the corridor with her document case in her hands and stopped, he was standing in the passage outside the solicitor's door in his greatcoat about to leave. And he went, still in a way that suggested the possibility of escape had occurred to him and been rejected. She had not spoken to him. She had understood, precisely at that moment, that she did not trust what she would say. She was not afraid of what would come out. She was afraid it would be too much, or too little, or precisely accurate in a way that served neither of them in this corridor, at this hour when there were other things that needed doing. What she did was this. The solicitor's office was at the end of a corridor that ran past a small waiting room. And in the waiting room there was a woman she recognized from the preliminary hearing, one of the minor claimants in an unrelated matter, a widow named Mrs. Cavendish, who had been waiting so long that she had grown pale and was sitting with her hands pressed together in her lap and the expression of someone who has been made to feel that their time is not worth accounting for. The waiting room had no fire, which was the kind of administrative discourtesy that costs nothing to correct and is never corrected. Cecily had stopped at the door of the waiting room and asked, very quietly, if Mrs. Cavendish had been offered anything. Water or tea, she said, or warmth. And, when the woman said no, she had gone to the clerk station herself and made the request, directly and without particular emotion, in the voice she used when she was not asking for anything but stating what was needed. A tray was brought within 5 minutes. She had sat down in the second chair and talked to Mrs. Perma Cavendish about nothing in particular. The weather, the difficulty of navigating Lincoln's Inn on foot, the inconvenience of the court's calendar, and watched a little color return to the woman's face. Mrs. Detting. Cavendish had been a solicitor's wife once, it turned out, which meant she and Cecily had a language in common, the language of people who have grown up understanding that the machinery of law is a great deal of waiting and very little ceremony, and that someone ought to have thought about the fire. She had not seen Edmund move. She had only become aware, when she finally rose to take her appointment and stepped back into the corridor, that he was still there. He had not left. He had not even stepped toward the door. He was standing where she had last seen him with his greatcoat buttoned, and his hands at his sides, and when she walked past him with her eyes forward and her shoulders straight, she felt the quality of his attention the way you feel the heat of a fire you were walking past without looking at. He had watched her. That was what she carried with her into the solicitor's office and sat with across the long, careful hour of preparation. He had stood in the corridor and watched her spend 10 minutes she did not have on a woman she did not know. Not because anyone was looking, not because there was anything to gain, but because the woman had been sitting there too long and someone ought to have noticed. It was a very small thing. It was precisely the kind of thing that looks like nothing and is everything. He said nothing. She said nothing. She went in to see her solicitor, and he left the building, and whatever reckoning the moment had produced in him, she could not know, because knowing things about this particular man had turned out to be an activity that required information he was not inclined to supply. The wound that Lady Dorothea had pressed with such practiced confidence had not opened cleanly. It had opened on the wrong side. Edmund had been 30 years old when he had met Caroline Pendleton at the end of her first season, which was the end of her second season, under a different arrangement that the family had managed carefully. He had been deceived about this, and about a number of other things. He had met her at a card party at the Hartington House in Berkeley Square on a Wednesday evening in May, and had found her in the candlelit drawing room, the most vivid person in the room. She had laughed at exactly the right moments. She had looked at him with her full attention in a way that he had read as sincerity and now understood had been technique. He had married her 3 months later in the belief that he understood what he was doing, and he had spent 3 years learning the distance between what he had believed and what was true. When Caroline left, she had taken with her not only the sum he had settled on her and the certainty of his own perceptions, but something more specific. She had taken his confidence that the evidence of his own eyes meant anything at all. He had looked at Caroline and seen someone transparent, and had been wrong. He had resolved in the years afterward to trust no document that had not been examined by someone more objective than himself, and to trust no woman's account of her own honesty, however compelling it appeared, until it had been tested by time and circumstance and at least one inconvenient moment. He had become, in certain respects, a careful man. He had become, in other respects, a man who carried a wound in the place where judgment lives, and who was therefore susceptible in the particular way of wounded things to pressure applied at exactly that site. His mother had used this against him with the precision of someone who had been watching where to place the blade for a long time, and had never been in any doubt about the location. She had not told him Cecily was lying. She had simply asked how he knew she was not. She had sat across from him in the green drawing room in Grosvenor Square with her hands folded in her lap and her voice entirely level, and had said that witnesses were uncertain, that memory was fallible, that young women of limited means had been known in such circumstances to overreach, and that he had, she believed, some personal history with the proposition that his first impression of a woman might not constitute reliable evidence. She had not been cruel about it. That was what made it effective. She had been gentle, measured, apparently reluctant, the performance of a woman raising a difficult subject only because she cared too much not to. She had produced the uncertain witnesses as evidence of her own good faith, not her own manipulation. She had framed the possibility of Cecily's dishonesty as a thing she wished were not true and feared might be. Edmund, who was not a foolish man, had looked at his mother's performance and had known it was a performance, and had told himself that knowledge was sufficient protection against it. He had been wrong about that as well. He had looked at Cecily's face, which was certain and composed, and did not ask him for anything, and had told himself that Caroline's face had looked like that too. He had believed this. He had believed it because the alternative, which was that he had allowed his mother to use his wound against a woman who had done nothing but wait, as he had asked, in the manner he had requested, keeping the secret he had specified, was a thing he could not look at cleanly. He had known, in the corridor of Lincoln's Inn, that he had made an error, not because Cecily had said anything, because she had not. Because she had walked past him with her document case and her straight shoulders, and gone to sit with a tired widow for 10 minutes. And she had not once angled toward him for an audience, had not arranged the scene for his benefit, had not done any of the things that a woman staging her own virtue would have done if she had known he was watching. She had simply done the thing because the thing needed doing. Caroline had never done a thing that did not have an audience. She had performed her kindness, her attention, her honesty. She had performed them well, and she had performed them specifically for whoever was watching. He had not seen it when he was 30. He saw it now, with the clarity of a man who has learned to recognize the difference between a thing that is true and a thing that is arranged to appear true, and who has been looking for the past 4 months at something that could only be one of those. The spring hearing convened at 9 o'clock, the gallery filled. Cecily stood at the plaintiff's bar in her gray wool gown and held the document, and waited. Mr. Duff opened for the defense. The word impostor appeared in his third sentence. He had the particular energy of a barrister who believes the strength of his case lies in the volume of his condescension, and he deployed it fully. The document was irregular. The witnesses were either unavailable or unable to corroborate. The young woman before the court had a comprehensible motive for fraud, namely access to a considerable fortune and title, and the court was invited to consider whether the credible explanation for this situation was a legitimate marriage the Duke of Ravenscroft had no wish to acknowledge, or a young woman of modest means who had overreached herself. The Lord Justice listened. The gallery listened. Cecily held the document. Edmund sat at the defense table with his jaw set and his hands flat on the table before him, and did not rise. The dark moment in any reckoning arrives not with noise, but with the particular quality of a door closing in a quiet room. Cecily had known, standing there, that this was what she had always been afraid of. Not that the court would not believe her, that he would not stand up. She did not look at him. She had made that decision the night before, working it out methodically, the way her father had always said to work out any position you intended to hold. Know in advance what you will do when the pressure arrives, so you are not deciding it under fire. She had decided she would not look at Edmund. She would look at the bench and at the document and at Mr. Holt, who was seated in the third row of the gallery on the left side, and who had met her eyes briefly as the session began, and given her a nod so small it was nearly invisible. Mr. Holt rose while Mr. Duff was still speaking. He was 64 years old, white-haired, with the settled authority of a man who had been correct in more courtrooms than most barristers had entered. He excused himself to the bench and identified himself. and the Lord Justice, who had appeared before Mr. Rawdon. Holt, on several occasions in the distant past when their positions were reversed, called the room to order with a single knock and asked Mr. Holt to proceed. "I was present, Mr. Proceed. Holt said, "at the ceremony of marriage conducted at the parish church of St. Giles in Hartmore, Derbyshire, on the evening of the 23rd of August, in the year 1813, I served as witness. I have in my possession a copy of the contract of marriage executed that evening, which I retained, as is my professional practice when I witness any instrument, in the event the original were disputed or lost. I would ask the court's permission to introduce that copy. The Lord Justice said the court would hear him. The document Mr. Holt produced from his leather case was cream-colored and folded in quarters. The seal on it was the seal of the Duke of Ravenscroft. The signature on it was the signature of Edmund Algernon Vane. The attesting signature below was that of Reverend Thomas Sable, whose living at St. Giles in Hartmore was entered in the registry, and whose handwriting could be verified against any number of documents in the diocesan records. The gallery went very quiet. Edmund rose. He did not ask permission. He simply stood, and the room registered it. And the Lord Justice did not call him to order, because there are moments in a courtroom when what a man is about to say is legible in the quality of his standing up. He looked at Cecily for the first time since she had entered the room. She made herself hold it. His face was not what she had expected. It was not controlled, not composed, not set, as it had been all morning. It was the face of a man who had been wrong in a way that had a specific cost, and who understood that cost, and was not at this moment engaged in avoiding it. "She is my wife," Edmund said. "She has always been my wife." 11 words. The gallery heard them the way a crowded room hears a window break. First the sound, then the understanding of what the sound meant, then the slow turn of many heads. Lady Dorothea Vane sat in the 4th row on the right side, with Miss Arabella Finch arranged beside her, and a small ivory fan open in her hand. The fan stilled. She said nothing. Across her face moved the expression of a woman who has held a position for so long that its failure registers not as defeat, but as a kind of bewilderment. The genuine and unguarded confusion of someone who had calculated everything and had not accounted for the one variable her arithmetic had omitted. That a man who had been afraid of his own judgment might eventually decide to use it. Anyway, Miss Finch rose quietly and excused herself along the row. She did not look back. She had understood, with the efficiency of a young woman who had been positioned and repositioned by her family for 2 seasons, and had learned what a room's shift in weather meant, that the weather in this room had changed, and that her position in it no longer served any purpose. She was not cruel. She was simply practical, and practically speaking, there was no longer anything here for her. The Lord Justice ordered a recess. Mr. Duff sat down with the expression of a man who has been handed the wrong brief and is beginning to understand it. Mr. Holt put his copy of the document back in his case and clasped it shut. Cecily set her own copy of the contract on the plaintiff's bar and let her hands rest at her sides. She had been holding it for so long that her fingers had gone cold. The warmth returning to them was a specific and peculiar sensation, like circulation, after long stillness. Edmund crossed the room in 3 strides, which was the only number of strides the room permitted. He stopped 2 feet from her. There was a great deal he did not say. She was aware of it in the air between them, the weight of things not said, and she understood that it was not avoidance but the opposite of avoidance. A man in the presence of something that required more care than a courtroom in recess could support. "Cecily," he said, her given name, in his voice. In this room, where she had been called other things, she said, "Your Grace." The sound he made at that was not quite a laugh and not quite the other thing. She thought it might be both. There was an afternoon then of procedure. Forms were signed. Mr. Holt's copy was entered into the court's record alongside Cecily's own. The registry of St. Giles at Hartmore was consulted by way of a rider dispatched at speed. Reverend Sable, who was very much alive and had a perfectly reliable memory for August of 1813, would confirm in writing within the week. Mrs. Partridge, interviewed at Ravenscroft Hall by the Duke's own solicitor, confirmed everything without hesitation. Yes, she had been there. Yes, she remembered the evening precisely. The rector had been kind, and the candles had been 2 of the good ones she kept for the family, and if anyone had thought to ask her 8 months ago, she would have said so then. Lady Dorothea left the courthouse in her carriage without speaking to her son. She had, by all subsequent accounts, very little to say for several weeks, which those who knew her well considered the most eloquent statement she had made in years. The evening of that day, Cecily sat by the window of the rooms she had been let on a quarterly arrangement in a quiet street off Sloane Square and looked at the last of the light, going from the sky over the city's rooftops. Someone had sent flowers, which meant Edmund had already instructed someone to send flowers, which meant he had arranged it before the session ended, which meant he had known before he stood up that he was going to stand up. She did not know quite what to do with that information. She put it where she had been putting things she could not yet process, which was beside the document case, which she had set on the small table, and had not yet closed. He came at 7 o'clock, as she had known he would, because Edmund had always, even at his worst, been punctual. She did not make it easy for him. She had decided that, as well the night before. Not in cruelty, not in retaliation, but because easy was not what this moment was, and pretending otherwise would have been a different kind of wrong. She poured tea. She sat. She waited while he said what he had come to say, which was a longer and more particular account than she had expected, because Edmund, when he finally chose to speak plainly, turned out to be precise about it. Caroline's name, what Caroline had done, what it had done to him, what his mother had said in the green drawing-room, and why he had listened, and what he had seen in the corridor at Lincoln's Inn that had made him understand that he had been wrong in a way that required action and not merely regret. He was not asking for forgiveness. She understood that. He was giving her the information she was owed. The full account, the way her father had always said a man should settle a debt. Completely, without qualification, and without requiring the creditor to name the amount. She sat with the tea going cold in her hands and listened to all of it. When he had finished, she said quietly, "You called me a fraud. I know." In open court. Yes. You will not be able to unsay that. No. He looked at her steadily. I am not asking you to pretend otherwise. The room was very quiet. Outside, London made its evening sounds, carriages, and a dog, somewhere down the street, and the distant call of a crossing sweeper. Cecily looked at him for a long moment. This man she had married on a Tuesday evening in August with the candlelight on the rector's vestments and her hand unsteady from the cold, and considered what she knew about him, which was considerable, and what she did not yet know, which was also considerable. She said, I should like to go to Ravenscroft. He went very still. The way he did when something had landed that he had not been certain of until it did. You have not seen the library, he said. No. Or the East Garden? No. Mrs. Partridge, he said, has been expecting you since August. Cecily set down her tea, and stood and went to the small table and took the document case in her hands and closed it, the brass clasp snapping shut, and set it under her arm. The cream-colored document was inside it. She had not yet found a permanent place for it in the order of her life, but she understood that this was the kind of thing that arranged itself in time, given a house in which to keep it. She said, then we should not keep her waiting any longer. They left London 3 days later, with the roads dry, for the first time since February, and the hedgerows just beginning, their slow, considered return to green. The carriage that carried them north was the Ravenscroft traveling carriage, which was considerably more comfortable than the mail coach Cecily had taken south in October, a fact she noted without comment, because there would be time, she supposed, for the particular pleasures of contrast later. Ravenscroft Hall sat in the Derbyshire hills above a valley that held the last of the morning mist until almost noon. They arrived in the early afternoon of the second day, and Mrs. Partridge was waiting at the door in her best gray dress with her hands folded in front of her, and an expression on her face that combined the relief of a woman who has been proven right about something with the satisfaction of one who has been expecting a particular guest for 8 months and was not surprised that the guest had eventually arrived. "Your Grace," she said, and there was a quality in how she said it. Not deference exactly, something warmer than that, a kind of recognition. A word that had been true since August, and was now allowed to be said aloud. The library was at the south end of the house, floor to ceiling, smelling of old leather and the particular dry warmth of rooms where fires have burned for decades. Cecily walked its length that first evening while Edmund watched from the doorway with his shoulder against the frame and his arms folded, and the look on his face of a man who is watching someone do something that cannot be undone, in the best sense of the phrase. There was a piano in the east drawing room that someone had left open. The last piece of music on the stand was a Haydn sonata, harshly turned as though someone had stopped mid-phrase and intended to return. Cecily did not know who had been playing it. She did not ask. She simply sat down at the bench and found the place in the music and played forward from there, into the room, into the evening, into the house that had been waiting for her since the last week of August. Edmund came to stand beside her, not touching, not speaking. Just there, in the particular way he had of occupying a room, the stillness that had been one of the first things she had noticed about him, and one of the things she understood now had always been tenderness held so carefully it had nowhere to go. She played until the candles needed attention, and then she stopped, and the last note hung in the air of the library long after her hands had stilled. She had left her father's document case on the desk in the study they had given her for her own use. The brass clasp was closed. The contract was inside, signed and sealed, and witnessed and recorded in the court's register. The word Her Grace written in Edmund's own hand, on the final page, in the particular formal script of a man who had been trained since boyhood to write his name on instruments that meant what they said. It was hers. It had always been hers. And now finally the house around it knew that too. If Cecily's story moved you, leave a thought in the comments. This channel exists because of the people who stay until the end, and you are very welcome here.